This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in the video. Following the Second World War, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, emerged as the newly acknowledged global superpowers. As they emerged from World War II as the victors, their brief friendship came to an end, driven primarily by their ideological and political differences, and with the addition of, nuclear weapons, the Cold War started between the two nations. While undeniably this was a troubled time in history, their rivalry created something incredible: a race to reach for the stars, to reach for the moon, to the creation of one of the most important achievements in not just US history, but human history, the Apollo space program.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by James CJ, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes. Subscribe and ring that bell and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures and, in this case, moments in history. Let's get to it. It was on October 4th, 1957, in the early years of the Cold War, that everything changed. At the time, space exploration wasn't necessarily at the top of the US's to-do list, but that was about to change when the USSR successfully launched the first artificial satellite into orbit, infamously known as Sputnik 1. This rattled the US, which believed they'd achieve such a scientific advancement first. The US had been working on its counterpart known as Vanguard. On December 6, 1957, they attempted to launch it on a test flight titled the Vanguard Test Vehicle 3, but after getting 4 feet into the air, the main engine lost thrust, resulting in the rocket falling back onto the launch pad and exploding. This was embarrassing because by now Sputnik 2 carrying Laika the dog had been successfully launched a month prior on November 3rd. So while the USSR had successfully gotten 2 satellites in orbit, the US had none. These successes on the Soviets' part and the failures on the US caused a belief that the US military had fallen behind in developing new technology. Eisenhower downplayed Sputnik's significance to the American people, but behind the scenes ramped up efforts to gain some ground when it came to space exploration. On January 31st, 1958, the US finally managed to successfully launch its first satellite into space with the Explorer 1. It was believed that there needed to be a more coordinated space program, and that's what 1958 was all about, with the creation of one of the most important agencies the 20th century would see in the federal government, NASA. In 1958, Eisenhower was under pressure from the scientific community to create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. Before NASA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, or NACA, which was founded in 1915, handled all aeronautical research in the federal government. The scientific community wanted to see a civilian agency dedicated to advancements in science and space exploration, but detached from the military due to concerns that it would be used to advance military priorities. Of course, there were national security concerns surrounding the Soviets' early achievements in space, with many believing it was a stepping stone to the USSR being capable of launching nuclear weapons from space. Eisenhower sent draft legislation to Congress on April 2, 1958, calling for the establishment of NASA following the Soviet threat becoming more credible. After various drafts of the legislation ironed out the details, it was signed into law on July 29, 1958, making it official. The success of Sputnik was arguably the starting point of the space race, and despite the USSR's early victories, it was still anyone's game. However, considering the US had taken second place in getting a satellite into orbit and eventually getting a man into space, they'd need to go big if they were hoping to win the space race. Then a young senator from Massachusetts became president, and at a special joint session of Congress in 1961, he announced a dramatic and ambitious goal: send an American to the moon and have them return home safely before the end of the decade. If you want your business to be as famous as the Apollo program, then you're going to need a snazzy website, and the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform perfect for entrepreneurs and hobbyists alike. Recently, I needed to make a simple website for a tabletop RPG I'm developing and playtesting to, make looking through the monster of a rulebook easier. And it was beyond simple to add sections, format, and even incorporate my existing knowledge of CSS and HTML, though you don't need any knowledge in that area at all. And it's all thanks to Squarespace's innovative Fluid Engine. The Fluid Engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website, answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. Drag and drop technology is included in every Squarespace site. But that's not all, because if you're working on a long-term project like the tabletop RPG I just mentioned, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create members-only content for your community. Monetize your projects by selling access to online courses, blogs, videos, and memberships. Start with a fully customizable website and earn recurring revenue by gating your content behind a paywall. Simply set the price and choose whether to charge a one-time fee or subscription for access. And then use Squarespace email campaigns, which makes it easy for you to spread the word about your project, engage clients, promote your services, and grow your business. Plus, if you're also as busy as I am, you can even set up email automations to stay connected, nurture leads, and save time. Ready to get started? Head over to squarespace.com/biographics for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use offer code Biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now back to the video. When JFK made his ambitious goal, later dubbed the Moonshot, known to American Congress and the public on May 25, 1961, the reasons were obvious. The US was playing catch-up, and they didn't want to be playing catch-up to the Soviets. By the time of his speech, the USSR had also become the first to launch a man into space with Yuri Gagarin, launched into space on April 12, 1961. Launched from Kazakhstan, Gagarin went on to complete a single orbit of Earth, becoming an international celebrity and yet another reminder of the US's shortcomings. The first American in space was Alan Shepard on May 5, 1961, once again making America the second to achieve a space first. Before making his ambitious announcement to Congress and the American people, JFK consulted with Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, NASA Administrator James Webb, and other officials to see the state of the space program and what it would take to be dominant. When LBJ reviewed the status of the American space program, Johnson concluded that the US has greater resources than the USSR for attaining space leadership, but has failed to make necessary hard decisions and to marshal those resources to achieve such leadership. Overall, from the get-go of Kennedy's presidency, things were dire in terms of the Cold War, with the very recent Bay of Pigs fiasco between the US and the Soviets only adding insult to injury. The USSR was showing dominance over the US, hence the need to go big and bold. With NASA's creation in 1958, numerous facilities were set up over the course of several years to advance the US space program. This started with NASA inheriting the old NACA field centers, like the Langley Research Center. Additionally, some facilities were transferred from the Army, like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, headed by Werner von Braun, a German rocket developer and former junior SS officer in World War II, who'd become one of the most important parts of the 1960s and the Apollo program. Finally, there were the facilities created by NASA itself, such as the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, the Mississippi Test Flight Center, now Stennis Space Center, the Manned Space Center, now the Johnson Space Center, and the Launch Operations Center in Florida, now the Kennedy Space Center. These NASA-created sites were proposed, approved, and constructed throughout the early 60s. In addition to new facilities and updated existing ones across the country, NASA began employing hundreds of thousands of Americans. The US started taking the space race far more seriously, investing heavily in the Mercury and Gemini programs, which would be handling various pieces to the larger goal of the Apollo program's objectives. To achieve this, the US government allocated a total of $25.8 billion over the course of the program's decade-long existence, which is equivalent to $318 billion today, and at times made about 4.41% of the federal budget. At the peak of the program, a total of 410,000 men and women worked in various capacities, including engineering, research, development, and training. Additionally, over 20,000 universities and industrial firms were relied upon for their support in aiding NASA's efforts. But with the infrastructure slowly coming into place, it was finally time to prove the investment was in fact worth it. Despite the funding and manpower going into NASA and the various programs, there was a great deal of doubt among NASA employees, Congress, and the public at large that America could pull off such an ambitious goal set by a young, charismatic president with a lot to prove. In fact, in 1963, JFK began expressing concern about the program and its cost, and even went on to propose a joint effort with the USSR. Kennedy suggested this a few times, most notably on September 20th, 1963 at the United Nations General Assembly, which caught the Soviets and Americans off guard. Kennedy stated his belief was that they were both making an effort to get to the moon, and their parallel efforts meant a duplication of research, construction, and expenditure. Most, of course, believed it largely had to do with the lunar mission's price tag, which continued to balloon. It was not policy but economics, and a fear of political fallout at home behind Kennedy's offer. Regardless, then General Secretary of the USSR Nikita Khrushchev didn't embrace the offer, and after Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, the offer became nothing more than an intriguing part of history. It's important to make note of the fact that Kennedy wasn't a space enthusiast and was in some ways a NASA skeptic, mainly due to the cost. But like Eisenhower, the Soviet advances cornered him politically into making the bold moonshot goal. Following Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, the space program and Kennedy's goal rested in Lyndon B. Johnson's hands. Johnson had a record of being very proactive when it came to US space efforts, having played a major role in the creation of NASA, with historian Andreas Reichstein noting all actions of Congress with regard to space between 1957 and 1961 can be attributed to Johnson. When JFK announced Moonshot, he appointed Johnson to chair the 9-member National Space Council, which Johnson had helped create following Sputnik. While Kennedy was great at selling a vision, Johnson was a master of getting the votes from Congress to fund it thanks to his deep ties in the Senate and unique methods. Considering the concerted efforts of some in Congress to cut Apollo funding, having LBJ at the helm was immensely important for the program's very survival. Johnson pledged to continue Kennedy's agenda and vision. That included putting a man on the moon. In the dust of World War II, the Allies found that across Germany and Austria, there was a wealth of smart and talented scientists and technicians. The US saw this as an opportunity to exploit the well of knowledge to better their military and industrial capabilities in what became known as the World War II secret immigration program, known as Operation Paperclip. Initially, the program was designed to help end the war with the Japanese, but after that ended quicker than expected, the project continued for 2 years and brought over 1,500 professionals from Europe. It wasn't just people the project targeted. The US seized an immense amount of Third Reich technologies that they believed were either competitive or superior to Allied technologies, with the vast majority of these technologies being rockets, missiles, and aircraft. As a result of these technological seizures, they needed the experts who'd created them. Among the scientists and engineers of Operation Paperclip was the aforementioned former SS officer Dr. Wernher von Braun. In 1950, von Braun and 125 other scientists like him were moved from Fort Bliss outside El Paso to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. Their objectives in Huntsville were centered around the development of the Army's nuclear-armed ballistic missiles, known as the Redstone program. His work on Redstone would later become modified to launch astronauts into space, specifically during Project Mercury. Von Braun began advocating for the US to get involved in spaceflight and exploration. After Sputnik, von Braun, along with his team of over 1,000 people, transferred to the newly established NASA, where they began work on several projects, further developing the US capabilities in space travel. These would become known as Project Mercury and Gemini, and they were just the start. Also, if you have time, maybe check out our bio on Wernher von Braun. The effort to reach the moon can be divided into three parts: Project Mercury, the Gemini program, and the Apollo program. Project Mercury was the first man-in-space program initiated in 1958 under Eisenhower, with the objectives of placing a manned spacecraft in orbital flight around the Earth, investigating man's performance capabilities and functions in space, and recovering the astronaut and spacecraft safely. It ran until 1963 and had 20 unmanned missions and 6 total flights with 6 astronauts. It included achievements like Alan Shepard being the first American in space and John Glenn becoming the first American to orbit the Earth. Collectively, the flights totaled 53 hours, 55 minutes, and 27 seconds. The Apollo program began in a theoretical capacity in 1959 when the name was floated by Abe Silverstein, who served as the center director at NASA's Lewis Research Center. The exact reason behind the name Apollo isn't a settled matter, with some sources claiming Silverstein was looking to top his other program named Mercury and chose Apollo because it was just an attractive name. Other sources state that Silverstein was looking through a book on mythology and saw Apollo riding his chariot across the sun, believing it was appropriate to the grand scale of the proposed program. Which is the case is unclear. In July 1961, NASA Director James Webb moved forward with the Apollo program. After several studies on how they'd approach the mission, they announced they'd adopt the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, or LOR approach, which meant a command module and a separate lunar module to achieve the lunar landing and return home. Other alternatives before the LOR was chosen were direct ascent, which meant a massive single rocket landing and taking off from the moon, or an Earth orbit rendezvous, which multiple launches take place and assemble a rocket in Earth's orbit before going to the moon. Financially, it was clear that the LOR approach made far more sense. Project Gemini, referred to as Bridge to the Moon, was designed as a bridge program between Project Mercury and the Apollo program. The objectives were to test equipment, create and implement mission procedures, train astronauts and ground crews, and create overall preparedness for reaching and landing on the moon, including spacewalks, docking, and endurance. It featured 12 missions over the course of 5 years, from 1961 to 1966, with 2 uncrewed orbital test flights and 10 crewed flights completed. Some major achievements of Gemini were the first spacewalk performed by Ed White on June 3, 1965, proving astronauts could survive for 2 weeks in space through the Gemini 7 the same year, and the first docking while in orbit with Gemini 8, piloted by Neil Armstrong on March 17, 1966. And we also have a bio on the Gemini program, so check that out. Links will be below. Overall, the Gemini program was one of the most important and successful projects NASA ever conducted. It solved key problems like controlled re-entry techniques, ensuring Apollo would burn up on re-entry, and pioneered docking with other spacecraft and rendezvous, which were essential for the LOR method NASA had chosen. Beyond Apollo, its results helped later in the development of the International Space Station, or ISS, and set the stage for the potential for human exploration on Mars, which we're still waiting on many decades later. The decision to ultimately move forward with the Apollo program means that at one point all 3 projects overlapped. It was a program where there were lots of moving parts and progress being made on every front. The massive undertaking of getting to the moon, landing on the moon, and returning home meant the Apollo program needed a spaceship not only worthy of the mission, but capable of pulling that off. Based on their decision to use the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous approach meant they needed a spaceship with 3 parts: a rocket to leave the Earth, the command module to serve as the mission control and carry the astronauts on their journey, and finally the lunar module, which would land astronauts on the moon and return them to orbit. Each played a pivotal role in achieving the mission and ensuring nobody got left behind. Von Braun and his team developed the Saturn series of rockets starting in 1957. The first iteration was the Saturn I, which was used from 1961 to 1965 over the course of 10 uncrewed test missions. It was followed up by the Saturn 1B, which was used on the Apollo 7 in 1968 and the eventual Skylab mission in 1973. These 2 iterations of the Saturn series were primarily used to launch humans into Earth's orbit. The work on the first two iterations of the Saturn rocket culminated in the creation of the most powerful rocket ever built, the rocket that would go beyond Earth's orbit and make lunar landings a possibility, the Saturn V rocket. Standing at an incredible 363 feet and weighing 6.2 million pounds, the three-stage rocket was an engineering marvel. Boeing was involved in the creation of the first stage, which housed 5 F-1 engines producing 7.6 million pounds of thrust to achieve liftoff into space. The second stage was created by North American Aviation and featured 5 J-2 engines to help with travel through the atmosphere. Finally, the third stage, comprised of a single J-2 engine that helped propel the spacecraft on its trajectory to the moon, was designed by Douglas Aircraft. One of the crowning achievements of the Saturn V is that, unlike its first two iterations, it never once failed in flight, a testament to its design and construction. The next integral part of the spacecraft was the command module, which was the astronauts' home away from home during missions. Built by North American Aviation, it would be the only part of the spacecraft that would re-enter Earth's atmosphere when bringing the astronauts home. It had 3 main sections: a forward compartment used for re-entry, the crew compartment where the crew resided and operated during the mission with a hatch leading to the lunar module, and finally the aft compartment that housed fuel tanks and reaction control thrusters. The command module was also equipped with a heat shield to help withstand temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit upon re-entry. This cone-shaped spacecraft, measuring 10.7 feet in height and 12.10 feet in diameter, contained everything necessary for life support, communications, and navigation, as well as being the ticket home. Finally, there was the lunar module, which was built by Grumman Aircraft Engineering and was specific for the Apollo missions, to achieve lunar landings and ascent back to the command module. This was one of the biggest challenges the Apollo program faced. It featured no aerodynamic shape, so it couldn't operate in Earth's atmosphere, making its use exclusive to space. It used 2 stages, the descent and ascent stages. During the descent, it carried fuel, landing gear, and equipment, while during the ascent stage, it housed the astronauts, returning them to orbit. The module was 23 feet tall and could sustain only 2 astronauts for 3 days. This meant leaving 1 astronaut in the command module at all times was necessary. Its first use was during the Apollo 9 mission. These 3 components made up the Apollo spacecraft, which was designed over the course of 12 years, from its earliest foundations in 1957 when Wernher von Braun and his team began work on the Saturn series to its use in the 1969 moon landing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The first crewed flight in the Apollo program was Apollo Saturn 204, or AS-204. The crew included astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. They were officially assigned to the first crewed flight on March 21, 1966, and began intensive training for what was planned to be a 14-day mission. The goal was to prove the spaceworthiness of the craft and the service module's large engine to prepare for the great effort needed to reach the moon, land, and return to Earth. Grissom had participated in both the Mercury and Gemini programs and was the second U.S. citizen in space, and Apollo 1 would have been his 3rd time in space. White also participated in both the Mercury and Gemini programs and became the first American to complete a spacewalk. It would have been his 2nd time in space. Chaffee hadn't been to space yet, and Apollo 1 was set to be his first flight with NASA. Unfortunately, tragedy would befall Apollo 1 when on January 27, 1967, a little under a month before the February 21st planned launch, NASA and the crew conducted a pre-flight test where a fire broke out and swept through the command module. It started when Grissom first hooked up his oxygen supply and noticed a strange odor, which he said was sour, but after some discussion, they proceeded. However, the problem then became a high oxygen flow setting off the master alarm. Finally, a communication failure occurred between the control room and Commander Grissom, causing a hold on the countdown. At 6:31 p.m., they were set to proceed ahead with a countdown when a spike in oxygen flow in the spacesuits was noted. The crew attempted to follow the procedure for emergency escape, but the fire caused severe issues, with the cabin becoming overcome with smoke, slowing them down. While technicians on the outside attempted to run toward the sealed rocket, they were stopped when the command module ruptured, causing flames and thick black smoke clouds to billow from the small window. Some evacuated the site for fear that the fire would set off the launch escape system on top of Apollo, thus igniting the entire structure. Some technicians stayed behind to attempt to save the astronauts, but were pushed back by the increasing heat and dense smoke before ultimately succeeding in accessing the door and getting it off. But unfortunately, it was too late to save any of the astronauts of Apollo 1. It was confirmed by a medical board that Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died of carbon monoxide asphyxia, as well as thermal burns. An exhaustive investigation and the need to redesign the crew modules meant that future crewed launches would be postponed. In 1967, the flight was changed from AS-204 to Apollo 1 in honor of the crew who'd named it as such. Because this was after two other successful missions, Apollo 2 and 3 do not exist, with Apollo 4 being the next number in the sequence. Apollo 1 was a hard lesson to learn for NASA, but those who died did not die in vain. The failures of the mission meant that necessary changes were made to ensure such a fate would never happen again. While one could argue it shouldn't have happened to begin with, it was an unfortunate consequence of developing new technology, a practice that comes with risk, which the astronauts knew. A few years before his death, Gus Grissom said, after his Gemini mission, "If we die, we want people to accept it. We're in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life." The first manned mission of the Apollo program resulted in tragedy. Many wondered what this meant for the program overall and if America would continue its efforts to get a man to the moon after what had been a difficult run for the program and a tumultuous time for the nation. The Vietnam War was raging on and consumed much of the nation's oxygen, along with the continued civil rights protests and the lingering aftermath of Kennedy's assassination. Was anyone still interested or believing that America could fulfill JFK's promise? You'll have to find out next time in part 2 of the Apollo program, From the Earth to the Moon. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, tell us what to cover next in the comments, subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time, Space Cowboys.